Okay, let's stand. We'll go through our survey here. And I want to start at Mount Sinai because that's kind of the new section, and make sure you've got it down. So it's Mount Sinai. Then what he received at Mount Sinai were several things. The law, 10 commandments, 613 various laws. The tabernacle, how big it was, what it was made out of, all kinds of rules and things about the tabernacle. Levites and priests are inside the tabernacle. There were two sections on that. One had to do with how they were to be ordained or chosen, and the other had to do with how their process that they were to, how they were to serve. So Levites and priests, the offerings. This is the book of Leviticus. It began with, was it 7 offerings? I can never remember. I look it up too. 7 offerings and 5 feasts. It's at the beginning and the end of the book of Leviticus. So offerings and feasts. Then the book of Numbers, counting the faces. They took 2 census, one at the beginning of the book and one at the end of the book of Numbers, to find out the number of soldiers, the first census that they had. The second census was done for the division of the land, as to the larger tribe would get a larger section of land, and it was chosen by lot. So there are 2 censuses, counting the faces, but the book of Numbers also had the Kadesh Oasis, where the 12 spies were sent out, 10 said no and 2 said go. So the 12, the Kadesh Oasis, 12 spies are sent out, and they said no, so they wander for 40 years in the desert, and they die. That everyone 20 years of age and older. Then they go to Moab. That's the end of their 40 years. Moses gives the book of Deuteronomy, 3 sermons. And so it's Moab, Moses, and he's preaching. He's got his sermon notes there, and he's going at it. Sermons, and then at the end of the book, dies. So let's do it together. Mount Sinai.
Law, tabernacle, Levites and priests, offerings and feasts, counting the faces, Kadesh Oasis, 12 spies, wandered, dies. Moab.
Where did they end up? Moab.
Moses, sermons, dies.
Very good. Creation. Here we go. Creation.
Fall, flood, nations, 4,000 years. Persian Gulf, Salt, Sarah, Abraham, Lot, Terah, Tigris, Euphrates, Herod, Paradise, Sea of Galilee, Jordan River, Dead Sea, Mediterranean Sea, Israel, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, Jacob, Joseph, Egypt, Jews, Egypt, 400 years, bondage, Moses, let my people go, no, 10 plagues, Red Sea, Mount Sinai, law, tabernacles, Levites and priests, offerings and feasts, counting the faces, Kadesh Oasis, 12 spies, wanderers, dies, Moab, Moses, sermons, dies.
Now listen to the rhyme as we get into this section here. It's Mount Sinai, law, tabernacle. Now listen to the rhyme. So Levites and priests, offerings and feasts, counting the faces, the Kadesh Oasis. 12 spies, wonders, dies. It's all rhyming together. Levites and priests, offerings and feasts. Counting the faces, the Kadesh oasis. 12 spies, wonders, dies. Wanders. Am I doing it?
Yeah.
I can't hear that well.
You're probably hearing better than you think. I have to consciously think of that word. Very good. So what we'll do today is we'll finish up Deuteronomy. We left off chapter 10, kind of in the middle of chapter 10. We're in the second section of the book. There's an introduction and a conclusion of the book, but then in the middle are the 3 sermons of Moses, where the first sermon has to do with the historical events that occurred, and basically saying that you guys are stiff-necked, hard-hearted, but God has provided for you. You have gone to war and you have won battles against nations that were greater and stronger than you, i.e., as you enter into the promised land, obey, and God will provide for you there as well. The second sermon is a review of the law. We're halfway through that. He talked a repetition of the 10 Commandments. He gave the Shema, the Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. That was in chapter 6. So we're getting up then to chapters 9 and 10. We stopped at the middle of 10. In chapter 9, though, we see the rebellion of the people. Moses is going to remind the people that they have been very rebellious before God. They have been very hard-hearted. Mark, would you read chapter 9, verse 7?
Remember and forget not how thou provoked the Lord thy God to wrath in the wilderness. From the day that thou didst depart out of the land of Egypt till you came into this place, you have been rebellious against the Lord.
So why is Moses saying, remember? You've been rebellious. Why would he want them to remember their rebellion? So they know how to do it again?
Supposed to deter them.
Pardon?
Deter them from acting the same way.
All right. And how would it help deter them from acting the same way?
Watching, well, the consequences.
Yeah. It's like telling our kids, remember when you didn't obey me last time and you were grounded for a week? Remember how it wasn't fun, what happened? Remember how you disobeyed and this was the consequence? Do you remember? And use that as a help for you to not do that again. And so he's saying, don't forget how you provoked the Lord in the past. Then in verses 12 and 13, he tells them that their rebellion is actually not just their actions of what they did, their mumbling or whatever, but it has to do with their heart. The issue is that their heart is hardened. They are stubborn in their heart. Lynn, verses 9 and 12.
9 to 12?
Mm-hmm.
Can I go on up on?
No, I'm sorry. 9, verse 12 and 13. 9, verse
And the
12.
Lord said unto me, Arise, get thee down quickly hence, for thy people which thou hast brought forth out of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They are quickly turned aside out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten image. Furthermore, the Lord spake unto me, saying, I've seen this people, behold, it is a stiff-necked people.
Stiff-necked, what do other versions have there?
Stubborn.
Stubborn, stiff-necked, hard-hearted. That's their issue. So Moses is going to ask the people to make a total commitment to God. And he's going to give them several reasons why this kind of commitment to God should be made. So after reviewing about their stubbornness, he's going to tell them that what God is going to require of them. I love this verse. It's kind of like, okay, what does God want? What's his requirements for you? Chapter 10, Lynn, verses 12 and 13.
Now Israel, what does the Lord thy God require of thee, but to fear the Lord thy God, to walk in all his ways, and to love him, and to serve the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul, to keep the commandments of the Lord and his statutes, which I command thee this day for thy good.
Okay, there are 5 infinitives that are given there. Can you name them off? What was the first one? What were they asked to do?
Fear.
To fear. The second one?
To walk.
To what?
Walk in all his ways.
What verse are you in?
12.
12?
Walk does come second in mine too.
Does it in yours?
But you read that.
Oh, yes, okay.
Walk was second.
Yep, to walk. You're right, Bob. Sorry. I had my mind on the next one.
I'm sorry.
No, you're not reading my mind? I don't hardly know what's going on up there. Third one,
Love.
to love him. Fourth, to serve. And fifth, keep his commandments. So it describes what it is that God is asking of Israel. It's a parallel, basically, to chapter 4 and verse 40. It says, chapter 4, verse 40, Mel, I believe. Chapter 4 and verse 40.
Thou shalt keep therefore his statutes and his commandments, which I command thee this day, that it may go well with thee and with thy children after thee, and that thou mayest prolong thy days upon the earth, which the Lord thy God giveth thee forever.
Okay, so you are to keep these commandments so that it will go well with you and with your children after you, and so that you may live long in the land. God does not just arbitrarily, just out of his meanness and desire to control us, give us rules to follow to keep us from having fun, but rather it's to bless us, it's to that we can live long, that we can. How do they say it? Freedom requires boundaries, because otherwise freedom makes you its slave. So anyway, now he's going to give several reasons why we should totally commit to God, why we should be totally surrendered to him. So Kevin, chapter 10, verse 14, and then jump down to verse 17.
Behold, the heaven and the heavens of heavens is the Lord's thy God, the earth also and all that therein is. For the Lord your God is God of gods, the Lord of lords, a great God, a mighty and terrible, who regardeth not persons, nor taketh reward.
So what's the first reason that they should totally commit to God? 14 and 17.
Everything belongs to the Lord.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's sovereign. He's the God of all gods, the Lord of all lords. I remember I came to know the Lord in kind of an unusual way. Basically, I surrendered to the lordship of Christ before I understood the grace of Christ, as it was through Jehovah's Witnesses, and so they convinced me, basically because of who God was, that he deserved our total commitment, our total lives, that family, job, everything is more important. Everything is less important than that relationship that we have with God. He deserves our total commitment. And so when I was looking at becoming a Jehovah's Witness, I had already surrendered that whether it's family or job or anything in my life, God is more important. But then I came to understand the grace of God, that it was through faith that we are saved as a gift. And so then when I understood the grace, the commitment was already there. the surrender was already there. So I kind of went backwards. But it's the same for us. God is sovereign. We should submit to him. He's the Lord of lords, the God of gods. Second,
Oh,
Paul,
okay. Can I ask a question?
as long as it's not hard.
No, it's somewhere in here. It said that following the Lord's commands is considered as righteousness. The word righteousness. Now I can't find it again, and I was interested in knowing where it was and what it. Later on, it said that the Lord doesn't want our sacrifices. But anyway, I wanted to find out where it was, and I can't remember where I saw it. It's somewhere in Deuteronomy. And if that's so, he knew that people could not live up to the law already.
Yeah, let me, I was going to go to the New Testament. I'm not going to be able to find it here.
If you got, I should look that.
Anyway, I don't see it. Thought it was in James. James. Where does it speak of he who says that he has faith and yet has no works? Can that faith save him? Isn't that James? Here, James 18, or chapter 2, verse 18. That's the section. So then, look at verse 24. James chapter 2 and verse 24. It's maybe a parallel. I don't know which passage you're talking about in Deuteronomy, but
Yeah.
What were you saying, Paul, again?
Well, I was thinking that your obedience to the law is considered righteousness, and I know down the line.
Deuteronomy 6:25?
Oh, maybe. Let's take a look. And I wonder if it said like that anyplace else.
And it will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment for the
Yeah,
Lord
there
our
it
God.
is. You found it.
Good find.
yeah.
Obey all this law before the Lord our God. That will be our righteousness.
Yeah, look at 2:24.
James 2:25.
James.
James 2:24.
James 2 and verse 24. How is a man justified before God? How would you say a man is justified before God?
Well, the only real way. I mean, you can't do it this way.
I thought we were saved by faith and by faith alone.
Yeah, faith,
Yeah.
right.
Because the perfect works of Christ are imputed to us.
Okay?
So we are justified by works, just not
In-
ours.
Yeah,
You,
that's true.
you see the verse there, Paul? It's saying,
Yeah,
you see, a man is justified
that's what he does.
by works and not by faith alone. See, to me, a good example would be a coin. On a coin, the one side is that we're saved by faith and faith alone. And yet a faith that saves, on the other side of the coin, a faith that saves is never alone. So if you're looking at this side, you are seeing acts of righteousness. Those acts of righteousness, when they are on the same as faith, that's one coin. It's not a contradiction. We're saved by faith and faith alone, but a faith that saves is never alone. So if you're looking at, so this side is you're saved by faith alone. But on this side we see righteousness. So we are doing those acts of righteousness as a sign that we have faith.
Yeah.
And
So
I think
a
it's the same in
consequence of it. You
same in
can't have
Deuteronomy.
the works without the faith is nothing.
Is nothing.
Yeah. Why isn't the Old Testament talk about faith more then?
You can ask God when you get there. Why? Okay, second reason that we should totally commit to God and that we should it's because he chose Israel as his own. Look at verse 15 and verse 21. Is it Kevin or is it Danielle? Danielle, please. So I'm sorry, you got it already.
No, read chapter 9.
Chapter 10, verse 15 and verse 21.
Yet on your fathers did the Lord set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is in this day.
And then 21.
He is your praise, and he is your God, who has done these great and awesome things for you, which your eyes have seen.
So why should they totally surrender?
God chose them.
God chose them. He chose to love them. He has done awesome wonders for them. Why should we totally surrender to God? He chose us. The third reason that is in chapter 10, the third reason it gives, basically it's the negative, why they do not, chapter 10, verse 16. Why did they not totally surrender? 10:16.
They were stubborn.
Yeah, they were stubborn. So it says, circumcise then your heart, stiffen your neck no more. I see that for us today as when you are convicted of sin, quickly respond. Don't allow your heart to get hard. So when you have done something wrong and God convicts you of it, my prayer is, I don't pray so much that, Lord, keep temptations from me, that's a good prayer too. But my prayer is usually more, Lord, that when I sin, help me to quickly turn from it. If I need to confess it to others, that I would do that. Because the tendency is just kind of, oh, Lord, that wasn't important. That doesn't matter. Nobody knows. It was insignificant. Lord, I've used all kinds of excuses, and none of them work. Don't let your heart get hard. The fourth reason they should totally commit, chapter 11, verses 1 to 7. Is it Bob?
1 and 7 or
1 through.
Therefore thou shalt love the Lord thy God and keep his charge, and his statutes, and his judgments, and his commandments always. And know you this day, for I speak not with your children which have not known, and which have not seen the chastisement of the Lord your God, his greatness, his mighty hand, and his stretched out arm, and his miracles, and his acts, which he did in the midst of Egypt unto Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and unto all his land. And what he did unto the army of Egypt, unto their horses, and to their chariots, how he made the water of the Red Sea to overflow them as they pursued after you, and how the Lord hath destroyed them unto this day. And what he did unto you in the wilderness, until he came into this place. And what he did unto Dathan and Abiram, and the sons of Elab, and the son of Reuben, and how the earth opened their mouth, and swallowed them up in their households, and their tents, and all the substance that was in their possession in the midst of all Israel. But your eyes have seen all the great acts of the Lord which he did.
Why should they totally surrender?
Because of the acts that they've seen.
Yeah.
What?
Because of what they have seen, the mighty acts of God. Moses goes on to review basically those mighty acts, and Bob, you read those. The fifth reason that they should totally surrender to God is because God will, if they do that, God will give them success and longevity of life. Chapter 11, verses 8 and 9.
8 and 9, okay. You shall shall therefore keep the whole commandment that I command you today, that you may be strong and go in and take possession of the land that you are going over to possess, and that you may live long in the land that the Lord swore to your fathers to give to them and to their offspring.
So why should they obey? So that you may be strong and go in and possess the land, so that you may prolong your days. Because of God's blessing, His promise to bless us as we obey Him. So anyway, this whole section is talking about this idea of surrendering to God, of the hardness of your heart, and that we should turn from that for many different reasons. As the chapter ends, then he asks them to make a recommitment to the covenant, which is basically, if you obey me, I will bless you, and if you disobey me, I will curse you. So chapter 11, Joanne, verse 26 to 28.
See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn aside from the way that I am commanding you today, to go after other gods that you have not known. Okay,
so that whole section is basically talking about the command to make a total commitment to God. Then, after that total commitment, chapter 12, he goes on to talk about worship. In chapter 12, the 1 to 32, he talks about the place, the location of where they are to worship. He's going to instruct them basically that they're only to worship God in the sanctuary, in the tabernacle, and later that will be in the temple. But he begins by showing them what they are not to worship. He talks about the Canaanites in verses 2 to 4. Paul, chapter 12, verses 2 through 4.
Destroy completely all the places on the high mountains and on the hills, and under every spreading tree where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and burn their Asherah poles in the fire. Cut down the idols of their gods and wipe out their names from these places.
So this is where they're not to worship. Then Mark, I'm going to have you jump. All in chapter 12, verse 5. Where is it that they are to worship? Verse 5.
But unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put his name there, even unto his habitation shall you seek, and thither thou shalt come.
In verse 11.
Then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there.
Where did God cause his name to dwell? Ultimately, in the tabernacle, in the temple, in Jerusalem. But anyway, go ahead, Mark.
There shall you bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and the heave offering of your hand, and all your choice vows which you vow to the Lord.
Verse 18.
But thou must eat them before the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, thou and thy son and thy daughter and thy manservant and maidservant and the Levite that is within thy gates. And thou shalt rejoice before the Lord thy God in all that thou put thy hands unto.
And verse 21.
If the place which the Lord thy God has chosen to put his name there be too far for thee, then thou shalt kill of thy herd and of thy flock which the Lord has given thee, as I have commanded thee, and thou shalt eat in thy gates whatsoever thy soul lusteth after.
So there is some leeway, but basically he's saying over and over, where is it that you are to worship? In the place where God designates, basically in the temple, ultimately, although at this point it's the tabernacle.
When I was in Israel, we saw that in the old city of Dan, a place they had set up, another place of worship. This was after the two halves of Israel had split up, so that the northern kingdoms weren't going back to Jerusalem anymore to worship the Lord. They thought they were worshiping them there. a site that had everything that, I mean, had all the outdoor altars and so forth, and all the things that you'd have down in Jerusalem, only outdoors, and those structures are still there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were, but they weren't, I don't believe, worshiping Yahweh. Basically, they set up a false god. When the northern tribe split, they didn't want, let's see, it was Rehoboam was the king of Judah, the southern tribe. Jeroboam took the 10 tribes, and that's what became Israel and Judah. But Jeroboam didn't want the people going down to Jerusalem to worship, because he was afraid that they would change their alliance back to Judah, back to King Rehoboam. And so Jeroboam set up places of worship where they could worship outside of the temple, outside of God's rules, outside of God's covenant. And so that's the location over and over again. That's where they're to worship. In chapter 13, he talks about false worship. He's basically going to give us a way to identify a true and a false prophet. And to me, this is something that I want you to know, because we have people today that say that they are a prophet of God. And so how do we know whether a person is a true prophet of God? And God is going to give Israel, and thus us, 2 ways of identifying whether someone is a true prophet of God or is a false prophet of God. It's a very important issue, because a prophet is going to say, this is what God says that you are to do. Now, if it's truly God who's saying it, then we want to say, okay, yes. But if it is a false prophet, and not from God, but he has some other motive or whatever, then I don't want to follow that. So how do we know? And he's going to give us 2 ways to be able to evaluate it. One in chapter 13 and another in chapter 18. So Lynn, I believe, is it? Chapter 13, verses 1 to 3.
If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and giveth thee a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder come to pass, where he spake unto thee, saying, let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them. Thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet, or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God proveth you, to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul.
Okay, then also, Lynn, can you jump to chapter 18? Keep your finger in the 2 of them, because we'll be coming back to both of them. Chapter 18, verse 21 and 22.
And if thou say in thine heart, how shall we know the words which the Lord hath not spoken?
That's the question we have, right? How do you know if it's truly the word of the Lord? How do we know?
When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken. But the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously. Okay, so keep your finger in both, but I want you to go back and to look at chapter 13, verses 1 to 3. How is it that we can identify a true prophet of God?
The defining thing is not whether or not the sign comes to pass.
Where's the verse that says that?
It's really in 13:2, and the sign or wonder that he tells you comes to pass. And he says, let us go after other gods.
Okay, so it came to pass. Mm-hmm. In other words, he talked of something miraculous, something that a regular person couldn't know or do, and it comes to pass.
But then he says something that's contrary to Scripture. Let us go after other gods which you have not known, and let us serve them. You shall not listen to the words of that prophet.
So, in your own words, what's the test?
Whether it agrees completely with Scripture.
Okay. What's not the test, according to this verse?
Whether what they say comes true.
Yeah. See, even if their prophecy comes true, but if they are teaching something that is false to Scripture, then that is a false prophet. Okay, look at the other one. Can we do it before we get to this one, and then we'll ask some questions?
Okay.
Okay, chapter 18
Wait a minute.
gives us a second way of identifying a true or a false prophet. Verse 21 and 22, what's the second way of identifying a true or false prophet?
What they say does not come to pass.
Okay, so they make a prophecy, and if that prophecy if that prophecy proves to be false, then it is a false prophet.
Okay.
And it's not talking about 70%. I forget the guy, some weirdo guy, and he had produced a bunch of prophecies, and like 70% of them came true. The question is not, did 70% of them come true? The question is, did he make one that did not come true? And if he made one that did not come true, then he is a false prophet. So the test is not, let me put it up here. The first test has to do with doctrine. It is not that a miracle happens, he predicts a miracle and it happens. That's not the test, that he prophesies and it happens. That's not the test for a true or a false prophet. That he makes a prophecy and it happens. You go, oh wow, that's pretty something. That's quite something to prophesy something that's going to happen in the future, and it does. But that's not the test. The first test, even if he makes a prophecy and it comes true, but if he is also saying something that is contrary to Scripture, he is a false prophet. So the test is not if he makes a prophecy and it comes true. However, if he makes a prophecy and it doesn't come true, then we know also that he is a false prophet. So when we look at people today, I believe these same two rules can be applied. It's a very important question, because if it's a prophecy, then it is not just the word of a man. A prophet is one who speaks on behalf of another. And so even Aaron was called a prophet of Moses because he spoke on behalf of Moses. But we're talking about a prophet of God. Okay, so it's chapter 13 is talking about a warning about false prophets. And so he gives us that way of being able to identify a false prophet. Then in chapter 14, he's going through some dietary regulations. God is going to give directions to how Israel is to be holy, how they are to be set apart, how they are to be different. And so these dietary regulations, we've seen some of them before. I'm going to kind of jump over some of these. Chapter 14, verse 1, it talks about that they're not to mourn for the dead like other nations mourn for the dead. And it talks in verses 3, 11, and 21 that Israel is even to be unique in what they eat and what they don't eat. Verse 3, do not eat any detestable thing. Verse 11, you may eat any clean bird. And verse 21, do not eat anything you find already dead, and so forth. So it's just some dietary kind of regulations as to what they are to eat, not to eat, this kind of thing in chapter 14. But it has to do with their worship before God and how they are to live before Him. Then it goes into some tithes. Let's see, where are we at? Is it Lynn? Chapter 14. Would you read verse 22 and 23?
Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed that the field bring the fourth year of the year. And thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose to place his name there. The tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always.
Okay, so he's just talking about tithes. There's also a second tithe that is talked about here that is done once every third year, verses 28 and 29.
At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithes of thine increase the same year, and shalt lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he has no part nor inheritance with thee, And the stranger and the fatherless and the widow which are within thy gates shall come and shall eat and be satisfied. That the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thy hand which thou doest.
So it's a different tithe. That's not the one that's done on a yearly basis. There are actually two different tithes that are done on a yearly basis. This one is done every third year, and it went to the poor, to the widow, various orphans, this kind of thing. So the actual tithe on a yearly basis would have been about 23 1/3%, something like that. Chapter 15, the sabbatical year is talked about. We talked about this in the past. Every 7th year was to be a year of rest for the land. There was no planting, no harvesting that was to take place. But we're going to see here that even debts, the year of the sabbatical year, the debts were to be canceled and slaves were to be set free. So, Kevin, chapter 15, verses 1 and 2.
At the end of every 7 years thou shalt make a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called the Lord's release.
And then jump down to verse 12 through 14 concerning slaves.
And if thy brother, an Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, be sold unto thee, and serve thee 6 years, and then in the 7th year thou shalt let him go free from thee. And when thou sendest him out free from thee, thou shalt not let him go away empty. Thou shalt furnish him liberally out of the flock, and out of thy floor, and out of thy winepress of that wherewith the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, thou shalt give unto him.
And so good. So I was talking about several commands concerning the sabbatical year, the 7th year of rest for the land, concerning debts as well as slaves. Chapter 16 is talking about the festivals. There were 3 feasts that were to be observed every year, and it was to be observed at the tabernacle. It was the Passover, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. So Danielle, to get some of these 3, let's first look at 16, verses 2 and 3.
You shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd in the place where the Lord chooses to establish his name. You shall not eat leavened bread with it. 7 days you shall eat with it unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, for you came out of the land of Egypt in haste, so that you may remember all the days of your life, the day when you came out of the land of Egypt.
Okay, so the Passover. Verse 10 then, Danielle.
Then you shall celebrate the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a tribute of a freewill offering of your hand, which you shall give, just as the Lord your God blesses you.
And jump down to verse 13.
You shall celebrate the Feast of Booths 7 days after you have gathered in from your threshing floor and your wine vat.
And then it tells us where these are to be done, Danielle, verse 16 and 17.
3 times in a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and at the Feast of Weeks, and at the Feast of Booths. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord your God which he has given you.
Okay, so it has to do chapter 16 with the festivals. I guess I haven't been clicking on that sabbatical year and the festivals. Let me just say officially, Paul, I'm very willing to interact with you on the issue, but I'd prefer not to do it officially in a class. It's a very controversial issue, and
Yes.
I want to honor those that would hold a different view,
Okay,
and,
sure.
and so I'd prefer to do it privately sometime when we can.
Okay.
I'm very willing to talk about it, but I feel that as a group that we need to not be too strong on either side. That's
Yeah,
why
thank
I
you.
tried to hold. So thank you. Okay, so that's chapter 16. Chapter The last part of chapter 16 and into chapter 17, it's various commands concerning officials. The first one has to do with judges. And so these judges, it's told that they are to be fair, they're to be impartial, they're to be just. There are specific guidelines concerning someone who worships a false god. So anyway, who's next? Bob, maybe? Whoever's next. Chapter 16, verses 18 through 20.
Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee, throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. Thou shalt not wrest judgment, thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the words of the righteous. That which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Thou shalt. Okay.
Good, thank you. So I was just talking about judges, that they are to be fair, they're to be impartial, they're to be just, that kind of thing. Chapter 17 talks about the king, verses basically 17, 14 to 20 talks about the king. The monarchy was not a surprise to God. If you remember that what's going to happen, Samuel, the book of Judges, there's judges that are ruling Israel. God is seen as the king, and the judges are his, is it like surrogate, or his representatives that he is, that is on the earth. But at the time of Samuel, the people say, "We want a king," and it looks like they're forcing God's hand to assign a king. Samuel, we no longer want your sons, we no longer want judges, we want a king. And they say, like the other nations. But it didn't catch God by surprise. Back here, he's going to be talking about the regulations for the king. So let's look at chapter 17, verses 18 through 20.
And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priest, and it shall be with him, and he shall read it in all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of his law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel.
So what is he to do? Verse 18.
He's supposed to have that. He's supposed to know the law.
Yeah, he's supposed to know the law. He's to write down the law, and he is to follow it. It's to be with him, it says in verse 19. He shall read it all the days of his life. So he's giving instructions for the king. Then he also gives instructions for the priests in chapter 18. Again, it's going to be mentioned that the Levites have no inheritance, but there's going to be guidelines that he's going to give concerning what they shall receive from the sacrifices. Joanne, chapter 18, verse 1, and then jump to verse 3.
The Levitical priests, all the tribe of Levi, shall have no portion or inheritance with Israel. They shall eat the Lord's food offering as their inheritance. And this shall be the priest's due from the people. From those offering a sacrifice, whether an ox or a sheep, they shall give to the priest the shoulder and the 2 cheeks and the stomach.
So it's the part of the sacrifice that belongs to the priest. It's just instructions concerning priests. He also gives instructions concerning the prophets, and that's the chapter that I combined it together with our last thing because it's the same topic. How do you know a true prophet? And so we don't need to cover that again. So those were various officials of the land, chapter 16 to 18. Now in chapter 19, he's going to talk about the criminal law. He's going to talk about murder. He's going to talk about the city of refuge. He's going to talk about the difference between an accidental manslaughter as opposed to murder, premeditated murder. And so chapter 19, Paul, I believe, would you read verses 4 through 6?
4 to 6, okay. This is the rule concerning the man who kills another and flees there to save his life. One who kills his neighbor unintentionally, without malice aforethought. For instance, a man may go into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and as he swings his axe to fell a tree, the head may fly off and hit his neighbor and kill him. That man may flee to one of these cities and save his life. To how
Okay,
far?
that's good.
Okay.
Oh, through 6, actually. So he can flee to the city of refuge, to save his life, and verse 6 says, lest the avenger of blood pursue the manslayer in the heat of his anger and overtake him, because the way is long, and take his life, though he was not deserving of death, since he had not hated him previously. So it's just giving instructions concerning these various cities of refuge and manslaughter, involuntary manslaughter, we would call it. Any questions on? He also talks about theft, stealing land, changing boundaries. Chapter 19, verse 14. Mark.
Thou shalt not remove thy neighbor's landmark, which they of old time have set in thine inheritance, which thou shalt inherit in the land that the Lord thy God giveth thee to possess it.
Okay. He also talks in chapter 19 about witnesses, those who witness a crime that is taking place. Lynn, chapter 19, verses 15 to 21.
One witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin, in any sin that he sinneth, or at the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. When false witness rise up against a man to testify against him that which is wrong, then the men between whom the controversy is shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges, which shall be in those days. And the judges shall make diligent inquisition. Behold, if the witness be a false witness, and have testified falsely against his neighbor, then shall ye do unto him as he thought to have done unto his neighbor, his brother. So shalt thou put the evil away from among you. And those which remain shall hear and fear, and shall henceforth commit no more any such evil among you. Thine eye shall not pity, but life shall go for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot.
Okay, so then he goes on in chapter 20 to talk about warfare, that they were not to fear a superior enemy. They give a list of exemptions for military service. It talks about besieging a city and even cutting down of trees, that kind of thing. Lynn, chapter 20, verse 19.
And thou shalt besiege a city a long time, making war against it to take it. Thou shalt not destroy the trees thereof by forcing an axe against them. For thou mayst eat of them, and thou shalt not cut them down. For the tree of the field is man's life, to employ them in the siege. I
found it interesting. He singled out cutting down trees. But he talks about warfare in that section. Then he's going to, basically, there's going to be a large section now, chapter, maybe pull it up here, 20 through chapter 21 through 26. And it's just going to be, various subjects are going to be discussed. I'm not going to go through all of them. It's going to talk about an unsolved murder, treatment of a captive woman, inheritance rights, a rebellious son, dealing with criminals, dealing with immorality, just various miscellaneous matters that he's going to go through all the way through chapter 26. And I thought, so you know what they are, that they're there, but so various responsibilities, and then he's going to end this section of his sermon with, again, that asking for that commitment to follow him in verses 16 through 19. Can we read that whole thing? Chapter 26, verses 16 to 19.
This day the Lord thy God hath commanded thee to do these statutes and judgments. Thou shalt therefore keep and do them with all thine heart and with all thy soul. Thou hast avowed the Lord this day to be thy God, and to walk in his ways, and to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments, and to hearken unto his voice. And the Lord hath avowed thee this day to be his peculiar people, as he hath promised thee, and that thou shouldst keep all his commandments, and to make thee high above all nations which he hath made, in praise and in name and in honor, and that thou mayest be a holy people unto the Lord thy God, as he has spoken.
Did you get the idea that he wants them to obey God's commands in verse 16, to be careful to do them, verse 16, verse 17, he's declared that the Lord is God, you shall walk in his ways, keep his commandments, keep his statutes, keep his ordinances, and listen. You get the idea? Listen to his voice. You get what Paul's saying to his children here? Follow God. Listen to God in your life. Moses is going to be dying here in a few more chapters, and this is the end of his second sermon to them, and he's concerned about their waywardness. So he's reviewing the law, the rules that they are to follow in this second sermon. I can show it to you here. The law reviewed. So there's one last sermon that he's going to make, and it's chapters 27 to 30. And this third sermon has to do with the covenant. And Moses is going to be basically laying out the covenant, and then he's going to ask them eventually to make a commitment to this covenant. And this is going to happen several times throughout the history of Israel, where they're going to be called back and be asked, here's the covenant. Are you willing to follow this covenant of God? So he's going to describe it for us in these verses. And some of it is kind of like the directions that they should follow in making this covenant, what it should look like, what they should say. Basically, they're going to go to these two mountains. You can see it on the left and on the right. They're going to Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and basically 6 of the tribes are going to go to the one side and 6 to the other. Lynn.
Where is that? Is that on which side of Jordan?
That's on the west side of Jordan.
Yeah.
Have you been there, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, we haven't been there.
The
That's
city-
in that's Palestinian territory now.
Yeah.
That's Shechem, the
Yeah,
city of Shechem,
Shechem.
which is dominated by Palestinians,
Yeah.
just like Bethlehem is.
Yeah.
On the west side, so they had crossed over?
This is what they are to do after they cross over.
Construction, okay.
Yeah. Instructions for them and renewing the covenant. So they're going to take Israel and divide them up onto 2 sides of this mountain. The one side is going to pronounce the blessings of God if they obey God. The other mountain is going to pronounce the cursing of God if they disobey God. And so anything else I wanted to say here says, so let's look at chapter 28. Verses 1 and 2. I'll have you jump around. 28, verse 1 and 2.
And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God.
Okay, so what are some of the blessings if they choose to obey? Look at verse 3 on down. What are some of the blessings?
In the city, in the field, your womb, the ground, fruit of your cattle, herds, flock, basket, kneading bowl. Come in, go out.
Yeah. Verse 7. What's the blessing?
You're
They're going to defeat their enemies. Verse 8.
They'll have plenty.
Full freezers.
Yeah, full freezers. Yeah, your freezer's going to be full. And so forth. You can see, look at verse 11.
Prosperity.
They're gonna have money, lots of kids, and lots of animals.
Yeah. So, pretty nice blessings, huh? If they will obey, God is promising to bless them. The prosperity gospel is seen in the Old Testament. If they obey, they will be blessed by God. So the one side on the mountain, they're going to be saying these things. Blessed shall you be in the city. Blessed shall you be in the country. Blessed shall you be, that shall be the offspring of your body, and so forth, as they would go through. Then in verse 15, who was it that was reading? Kevin, would you also read verse 15?
Okay. But it shall come to pass.
What's the first word there?
But.
But.
Yep.
Excuse me. I just wanted to point that out. There's a transition taking place.
That's for sure. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee.
Okay, look at some of the curses.
Pretty similar to the blessings.
Similar, yes, but it's a little different though, too. And it's interesting to me that the blessings were basically chapter 28, verses 1 through 14. Look at the cursing. Where does it end? Goes for quite a little ways there. Now, some of these curses, cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the offspring of your body. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out. Now let me ask you, what if you were standing there and you were going to be asked, will you commit yourself to this covenant? If you obey God, look at these blessings he's going to give you. Wow. If you disobey God, these are the curses that God has given you. Would you be willing to sign and join the covenant?
And you probably really think you were going to do it, too.
They did. For me, my response, I'm glad I'm in the New Testament. And because I know my heart. And yet, God is a God of grace as well. And just like I mentioned earlier, that what God is after is not a perfect person. We're not going to be perfect. But that when I sin, when I disobey, that I would be quick. God's to confess, to repent, and to turn. God set up how they could be right before God. In the book of Leviticus, we talked about the process that they would go through. If you steal a lamb, you remember when we went through all of those various offerings. And so there is a way of forgiveness. I don't think God is expecting that you would be a perfect human being, but he did expect that you would repent and turn from your sin, not be hard-hearted. And to me, hard-heartedness starts slowly. It starts by saying no to God. And as you say no, and then you have to come up with other no's that you have to say, and it begins to build, and your heart gets harder and harder. But I'm glad I'm in the New Testament. The blessings are in verses 1 through 14, and the curses in 15 on through. But I want to look at chapter 28 and verse 64. 28:64.
Yeah.
Who's next? I think it's Danielle.
Moreover, the Lord will scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other end of the earth, and there you shall serve other gods, wood and stone, which you or your fathers have not known.
So basically they're talking here about it's the cursing section. And so Moses is saying here, the Lord will scatter you. And that's what we've seen happen with Israel. They have been scattered. And I haven't talked with a lot of Jews, but the ones that I've talked to are often either atheists or agnostic, or so many of them. Although there are many as well that are very devout Jews and things as well. But he's saying here that you will be scattered, you will serve other gods of wood and stone, which your fathers have not known. And we've seen that taking place today.
What do you mean by the numbers 7 and 22, Israel?
He's saying that they're going to scatter. The northern tribe, it was in 9, I can't come up with the date, they split around 900. In 722, Assyria came down and attacked the northern tribe of Israel and conquered that northern tribe. The people were then scattered. The Assyrians believed that the way to conquer a nation was to scatter them, to bring other nations to intermix with them so that they would lose their ethnicity, their nationalistic fighting. And so they took the Israelites, the northern tribe, in 722, and they scattered them. They brought other nations, other peoples into Israel to mix those. It's what we know as Samaritans, these mixed Jews and other nations. In 586, the southern tribe of Judah was conquered by Babylon. Babylon had a different philosophy. They took the people and they took them to Babylon. There they became slaves, but they also became quite rich and servants and various things. And basically they were allowed then under Cyrus to come back 70 years later. They returned and rebuilt the temple. But 586 is when God scattered them from the land. Conclusion. Moses is going to do we're going to see two things in these chapters in the conclusion. We're going to see the leadership transitioning to Joshua, and we're going to see the death of Moses. Are the two main things, but I want to spend some time on the song of Moses as well. Moses prepares for that change of leadership. Joshua is going to take over. Is it Bob or who's next? Chapter 31, verses 7 and 8. It's right after chapter 30.
What was it, 30?
31, 7 and 8, please.
And Moses called unto Joshua, and said unto him in the sight of all Israel, Be strong and of good courage, for thou must go with this people unto the land which the Lord hath sworn unto their fathers to give them. And thou shalt cause them to inherit it. And the Lord, he it is that doth go before thee, he will be with thee. He will not fail thee, neither forsake thee. Fear not, neither be dismayed.
You see that little phrase, he will be with you? That phrase and a similar phrase occurs several strategic times in Scripture. If you remember Moses when he was at the burning bush and he said basically, I don't have the ability to do this, God. And God said, I will be with you. It happened with Jeremiah. Jeremiah came, God was calling him as a prophet, and Jeremiah said, I'm but a child. And God said to Jeremiah, I will be with you. Gideon he had an angel that appeared to him and said, "Oh, mighty warrior," and Gideon was hiding in a wine press, stamping out wheat, something, and this angel comes and says, "Oh, mighty warrior," and Gideon says that I'm the least of my family. We're not an important family, and you're saying I'm going to lead the people. And the angel says that God will be with you. And we see it in the New Testament in Matthew 28, that same phrase, God will be with you, in the Great Commission, chapter 28. Even to the end of the age, speaking of us.
Oh.
You go back to 29:29, it's a pretty important verse there. Secret things belong unto the Lord our God. But those things which are revealed belong unto us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of this law.
Amen. It sets the limits on God's purpose of his revelation. Some things he chooses to keep to himself, and yet many things he has chosen to reveal to us. I don't know if you've ever been approached by someone that says, what right do you have to tell me that I'm a sinner and going to be judged by God? Basically they don't believe what God has revealed to them. And yet they say that we are proudful, arrogant, because we're saying that this is what God is going to do. But actually, I think it's their pride and arrogance that doesn't accept what God has told them is going to happen. And so God has given us much information about who he is and what our responsibilities are to him. So Moses is going to die, but he's going to give a copy of the law to the priests. He starts out by saying Joshua is going to take over. God is going to be with him. God is going to go ahead of him. He says, God will be with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. Do not fear. Make a good sermon. Do not fear. Then in verses 9 through 16, Moses takes the law and he's going to put that basically, he's going to instruct the priests that they are to read this law to the people. Chapter 31, verses 9 through 13. Who's next? Okay.
The Lord wrote this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. And Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, at the set time in the year of release, at the feast of booths, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place that he will choose, you shall read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and little ones, and the sojourner within your towns, that they may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God, and be careful to do all the words of this law, and that their children who have not known it may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess.
Okay. Then in verse 14, he talks about God announces the impending death of Moses. So verse 14, 31:14, please, Joanne.
And the Lord said to Moses, behold, the days approach when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tent of meeting, that I may commission him. And Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tent of meeting.
So he's announcing the time for you to die is near. But before he dies, God is going to give Moses a song. And this is a song in chapter 32 that Moses is to teach the children of Israel. And it's basically to be a reminder for them to follow God. So I want us to walk through this song and things together because it's pretty neat. Let's begin, though, chapter 31 to get an introduction to this song. Chapter 31, verses 19 through 22, Paul. 31:19.
Now write down for yourselves the song and teach it to the Israelites, and have them sing it, so that it may be a witness for me against them. When I have brought them into the land flowing with milk and honey, the land I promised on oath to their forefathers, and when they eat their fill and thrive, they will turn to other gods and worship them, rejecting me and breaking my covenant. And when many disasters and difficulties come upon them, this song will testify against them, because it will not be forgotten by their descendants. I know what they are disposed to do, even before I bring them into the land I promised them on oath. So Moses wrote down this song that day, and taught it to the Israelites.
Okay, so in chapter 32, in verses 1 to 4, I'm going to try to go fairly quickly. In verses 1 to 4, he talks about the faithfulness of God. He says, I ascribe his greatness, I proclaim the rock, his work is perfect, his ways are just. So verses 1 to 4 is speaking about who God is, the faithfulness of God. And yet, in verse 5, he talks about the unfaithfulness of the people. They have acted corruptly, just after talking about God, that he is righteous, he is upright, that they, the people, have acted corruptly toward him. They are not his children because of their defect, but are a perverse and crooked generation. Then in verse 10, he goes on, God brought the people out of the desert. He carried them. He guarded them. In verse 10, it says, he found them in a desert land and in the howling waste of a wilderness. He encircled them. He cared for them. He guarded him as the pupil of his eye. And then he goes on to talk about Israel when they became rich. They forsook the Lord. I want to look at those verses. It's 15 to 18. But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You are grown fat, thick, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scorned the rock of his salvation. They made him jealous with strange gods. With abominations they provoked him to anger. So it's talking in that section how God blessed them. They became rich, and yet they forsook the Lord. And thus in verses 23 to 25, God is going to judge them. Verse 23, I will heap misfortunes on them. I will use my arrows on them. They shall be wasted by famine and consumed by plague and bitter destruction. And the teeth of beasts I will send upon them. So it's the judgment of God. Verse 39, he announces his sovereignty. See now that I am he, and there is no God besides me. It is I who put to death and give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal, and there is no one who can deliver from my hand. So God is using this song in order to remind the people that when they disobey, that they should repent and turn and follow God. I should mention that, this hardness of heart is not going to be fully met until Christ. And it's the kind of thing that I see God working in various times in order to show us that we are not of ourselves able to obey God. Adam and Eve were not able to obey God in a perfect world. Everything perfect. The Jews, you would think that they've got all of the rules laid down, that they could have followed them. You would have thought that they could have followed them, and yet they did not. maybe we don't have the strength, the power to obey God. So God gives us today the very Holy Spirit to live in us, to give us the strength to overcome. And yet, we continue to have a hard heart before God. Well, maybe it's Satan. So in the millennium, for 1,000 years, God is going to bind Satan. And yet, even in the millennium, though rebellion is going to be suppressed for a time, there will be those in the millennium who have a perfect king, a perfect ruler. The land is going to be restored. A lion and a lamb are going to sleep together. A child will be with a cobra and not be hurt in the millennium. And yet, even then, people will not choose to obey God. It's a hardness of heart, and the only solution is found in Jesus Christ. God himself stepped in order to provide a way that we could be forgiven. And it is through faith as a gift that he gives to us. And then as a response, as we were talking, that righteousness that we strive to live out. Positionally, we are made righteous before God. We are endowed, we are imputed. The righteousness of Christ is given to us. And so before God we stand as righteous. But our hearts are still hard before him. Moses is going to die. I guess we should look at his death. Chapter 32. I want to do 32 and 34, or is it Mark, I think? 32, 48 to 52. We'll see Moses as he's going up to die and seeing the land. 48 to 52.
And the Lord spoke to Moses that selfsame day, saying, Get thee up into this mountain Abiram, unto Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, that's over against Jericho, and behold the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel for a possession, and die in the mount whither thou goest up, and be gathered to thy people, as Aaron thy brother died in Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people. Because you trespassed against me among the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, because you sanctified me not in the midst of the children of Israel. Yet thou shalt see the land before thee, but thou shalt not go thither into the land which I give the children of Israel.
And then jump to Mark 34, verses 4 to 9.
And the Lord said to him, This is the land which I swear to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it unto thy seed. I have caused thee to see it with thine eyes, but thou shalt not go over thither. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, over against Beth Peor. But no man knoweth of his sepulchre to this day. And Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated.
So Moses dies, a great man of God that God spoke directly to. But there is one like Moses, the scriptures tell us, that is coming from the Old Testament, and that is Jesus Christ. One like unto Moses. And yet Joshua, the son of Nun, notice verse 9, filled with the spirit of wisdom. And he will be the next book, which is the next class. I want to talk about the exam. I've got them someplace here. I did not have time to put names on them, so make sure you put your name on them as you take them. I want to do a quick review of what's going to be on the exam.
Just a couple quick things. Okay. Could Moses and Joshua be considered judges also? Oh, not really? Something different? What you call them?
Great men of God.
Okay.
I mean, Moses was quite unique.
Yeah.
Because God spoke to him as a man speaks to a man. The other prophets of God, so God would speak through a dream or through a vision, this kind of thing. So he's not He's quite unique. Joshua was before the judges.
Yeah.
And so he is has the spirit of like unto Moses.
One little thing too, I missed a point under total commitment. There was like 5 points, reasons to commit.
5 reasons
I
to
missed
commit.
the first one. If I could just, if somebody has it.
Somebody have that?
Are you talking on page 6, that one? Why obey God?
Yeah, here are the other ones. So what was the first one?
First one is 10, 14, and 17, everything belongs to God.
Okay. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to share with you over probably about 2/3 of what's going to be on the exam. I've made some changes, hopefully for the good. You'll find out. I want you to know the key words for all of the books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Sometimes it's a phrase. For the book of Genesis, the big N-ings, the big N in Genesis, the beginnings. So it spoke of the beginnings of man, the beginnings of the universe, the beginning of God's people. Exit for the Exodus. You have it in your notes. So offerings and feasts was the book of Leviticus, Left-Footicus. The book of Numbers was Wanders. How did I do?
Good.
And the book of Deuteronomy, the second law. But I want you to know those words. Now, on our survey, you can pay me later, but you do not have to know what the meaning of the words are. You do not have to give any of the explanations of what this reminds us of. You only have to write down the words, but it's going to be from creation all the way through to the end of death of Moses. And so none of them before the places you didn't have to give an explanation. Remember that? But all the others you had to give a one sentence. No one sentences for any of them, but I want you to do it all the way from creation to the death of Moses. You're supposed to go, oh, thank you. That's wonderful news. Should make it somewhat easier. But it is longer. That's the oh no part, I assume. So there will not be the outlines. There will not be the one-sentence summary. So that is different from last time.
There's not outlines of the books?
Not outlines of the books. That's the good news. The bad news, the first 10 questions are basically a review, and there's actually more than 10, but because some of them have several parts, but is basically a review of the major events and people that we talked about in our PowerPoints. So a good way to review is to look at the PowerPoints and look at the major events, look at the people and who they were, because I've got basically maybe 8 questions on those types of questions. So it's going to be a short answer. You can answer it in 1 or 2 sentences, but like, what was Korah's rebellion? Or why was the serpent placed on top of the pole? Events that happened, that kind of thing.
All the way back to September?
Somewhat, the emphasis is in this section of the second, since the midterm, but it's not entirely. Some of the more the people and things will cover both. But it's the major events, not the minor, I hope, in that's my evaluation of what's major and minor. But
This isn't the form of an essay question, is it?
No, that is just saying that you have to list in order the events and place and people of creation up to for the books of the law. You'll do well, Paul.
But the order isn't straightforward. Oh, gee.
Okay, any other questions?